Hey everyone. Tonight we're heading somewhere you've probably never imagined. To beaches where the sand crunches under your feet, and every smooth, glossy shell you spot might as well be a $20 bill waiting to be claimed. Honestly, you wouldn't make it an hour out here. Most people today would tap out before sunrise. Survival score. A generous 1 star. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Lower the lights, let the quiet hum of the room fill the air, and let's drift into tonight's story. You're standing on a beach in the Maldives, sometime around the year 1200. The sun is warm on your shoulders. The ocean stretches endlessly in shades of turquoise and deep blue, and at your feet, half buried in wet sand, is a cowrie shell. You pick it up, smooth, porcelain white on one side, with a narrow slit opening on the other that looks almost like tiny teeth. It's beautiful in that effortless way seashells are, the kind of thing you'd pocket on vacation and forget about in a drawer at home. Except here, in this moment, you've just picked up money. Real, actual, spendable currency that works across thousands of miles of coastline, from the islands of the Indian Ocean all the way to the markets of West Africa and the trading posts of China. The cowrie shell you're holding, specifically the money cowrie, monetaria moneta if you want to get technical about it, though nobody here is using Latin, is one of the most successful forms of currency in human history. Not successful in the way we usually measure success, with stock markets and reserve banks, but successful in sheer geographic spread and longevity. These little shells were used as money for over 3,000 years. 3,000. That's longer than most empires lasted. Longer than any paper currency has survived, longer than your favorite restaurant has been in business, probably by a factor of several thousand. You turn the shell over in your palm. It weighs almost nothing, maybe a gram or two. It's roughly the size of your thumbnail, though some are smaller, some slightly larger. The surface has a gloss to it, naturally polished by ocean currents and time. There's something satisfying about the weight of it, or rather the lack of weight. You could carry 1,000 of these without breaking a sweat. Try that with stone coins or slabs of silver and see how far you get. The beach around you is dotted with people, locals who have been harvesting these shells for generations. They wade into the shallow water, reaching down to pluck cowries from rocks and coral. It's not random beachcombing. There's technique involved, a practiced eye for spotting the right species, the right size, the right quality. Not every cowrie works as money. Some are too big, some too small, some the wrong color or shape. The money cowrie, though, this one's perfect. Standardized by nature itself, which is convenient when you're trying to build an economy. You watch a woman nearby string shells onto a length of fiber, creating a long necklace of currency. She's methodical, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who's done this 10,000 times before. Each shell clicks softly against the next. When she's done, she'll have a string worth, what? A week's food, a bolt of cloth. The value shifts depending on where you are, what year it is, how far these shells have traveled from their source. Here, on the islands where they're harvested, they're abundant. Less valuable. But transport them across the Indian Ocean to Bengal, or overland to Uganda, or by caravan to the markets of Timbuktu, and suddenly, each shell is worth considerably more. It's basic economics. Supply and demand, playing out with seashells instead of securities. The question that scholars still debate is why cowries became money in the first place. Why these shells and not others? There are plenty of beautiful shells in the ocean, But cowries have specific advantages. They're durable, nearly impossible to break unless you really try. They're distinctive, hard to confuse with anything else. They're portable, uniform in size and shape, and perhaps most importantly, they're difficult to counterfeit. You can't just carve a fake cowrie out of wood or stone and expect it to pass. The gloss, the weight, the specific shape of that toothed opening, nature built in anti-counterfeiting measures that medieval mints would envy. You pocket your shell and start walking along the waterline. The Maldives stretch around you, a scattered handful of coral islands in the middle of the ocean, and you're standing at the source of a currency that will travel further than most people of this era will ever go. These shells will cross deserts, mountains, seas. They'll pass through dozens of hands, facilitate thousands of transactions, outlast governments and kingdoms and languages. There's something almost absurd about it. The idea that this tiny, fragile object from the ocean floor will become more trusted, more widely accepted than the pronouncements of kings or the promises of merchants. And yet, that's exactly what happens. In West Africa, cowrie shells will become so entrenched as currency that they'll still be in use in the early 20th century. In China, the character for money, Chinese letter, is based on the cowrie shell, a linguistic fossil from an era when these shells were the standard. In India, they'll be used to pay temple taxes, wedding dowries, market fees. They'll buy grain, cloth, livestock, land. They'll be strung by the hundreds, by the thousands, measured out in specific denominations that everyone understands. The sun is starting to dip toward the horizon now, painting the water in shades of amber and rose. You're still holding that single cowrie, feeling its smooth weight in your hand. Somewhere out there, across the ocean, someone is accepting a string of these as payment for a cow. Someone else is counting them out to pay their rent. A merchant is calculating profit margins in cowries per basket of rice. An entire economic system is running on seashells, and somehow, improbably, it works. It works because everyone agrees it works, because trust is built into the weight of these strung shells, because value is always, ultimately, a collective decision. You set the cowrie back down on the sand, watching as a wave rolls in and tugs it back toward the water. Tomorrow, maybe someone else will find it. Maybe it'll end up in a merchant's pouch, beginning its long journey inland. Or maybe it'll just stay here, another shell on an endless beach, indistinguishable from millions of others. The difference between money and decoration is thinner than you'd think. Just a matter of consensus, of shared belief, of everyone agreeing that, yes, this particular shell matters. You're walking now, away from the beach, moving inland and backward through time simultaneously. The sand gives way to packed earth, then to stone, and suddenly you're on a Roman road, the kind that will still exist 2,000 years later, stubborn and straight as the empire that built it. The sun is hotter here, Mediterranean heat that bakes everything, and you're following a line of workers who are hauling something on their backs that looks mundane until you remember what century you're in. They're carrying salt. White, crystalline, heavy salt, and they're sweating under the weight of it. Ironic, really, since they're losing salt through their pores while transporting it on their shoulders. You fall into step behind them. The road stretches ahead, paved with those precisely fitted stones that Romans were obsessed with, the kind of infrastructure that makes modern highway departments look lazy. These men are heading to Rome, probably, or to one of the regional markets where salt is weighed, taxed, and distributed. They don't look thrilled about it. Salt is heavy. A full load might be 60, 70 pounds of the stuff, and you're walking miles in the heat, which seems like some kind of cosmic joke. carrying the thing that could help preserve your hydration while simultaneously sweating buckets. Here's something that'll change how you think about your morning. The word salary comes from salt. Salarium. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt or given an allowance to buy it, and that linguistic fossil has survived empires, language shifts, countless cultural upheavals. Every time you complain about your salary being too low, you're etymologically complaining about not having enough salt. Which, granted, would have been a legitimate complaint in ancient Rome, where salt wasn't just a seasoning, it was survival technology. You watch the workers pause at a way station, setting down their loads with audible groans of relief. One of them unwraps his bundle slightly, checking the contents. The salt inside is chunked into rough blocks, grayish-white, not the fine powder you'd recognize from a shaker. This is the real thing, harvested from coastal salt pans where seawater is channeled into shallow pools and left to evaporate under the sun. It's labor-intensive, time-consuming, and the end result is this: rocks of crystallized sodium chloride that are somehow worth their weight in, well, salt. Which is to say, worth a lot. The reason salt became money is straightforward enough that even modern people would get it. Before refrigeration, before canning, before vacuum sealing and freeze drying, salt was how you kept food from rotting. Meat, fish, vegetables. Salt them properly, and they last months instead of days. In a world where famine was always one bad harvest away, preservation wasn't luxury, it was life or death. Salt meant you could store food through winter. It meant you could transport provisions on long journeys. It meant armies could march without immediate access to fresh supplies. It meant civilization could build cities instead of everyone staying close to their food sources. So naturally, whoever controlled salt controlled a significant chunk of the economy. The Romans understood this, which is why they built roads specifically for salt transport. The Via Salaria, the salt road, running from the salt pans at Ostia straight to Rome. It's still there, actually, though now it's used for cars instead of salt caravans. You're walking on a currency highway, basically, where the product and the payment were sometimes the same thing. There's a moment, and historians still argue about exactly how widespread this was, where Roman soldiers might literally receive salt as payment. Whether this was regular practice or occasional circumstance depends on which sources you trust and which ones you think are exaggerating. What's not debated is that salt had standardized value, that it was used in transactions, that it could be exchanged for other goods with generally accepted rates. A pound of salt might get you a certain amount of grain. A block might be worth a day's labor. The specifics shifted by region and era, but the principle held: salt was currency, even if it wasn't the only currency. You continue walking, and the landscape changes as you move. You're passing through time zones now, not just geographic ones. Salt remains constant, but the contexts shift. You're in medieval Europe, watching salt merchants calculate taxes. You're in Venice, where salt monopolies make families wealthy enough to build palaces. You're in the Sahara, watching caravans carry salt blocks south, where they'll be traded for gold. Literally pound for pound in some markets, which seems impossible until you consider that gold doesn't preserve your meat, and salt does. The thing about salt as money is that it has intrinsic value, unlike paper currency or even metal coins if you think about it hard enough. You can't eat gold, you can't season your food with silver, but salt does something. It performs a function that people desperately need. This makes it both more stable and more volatile than abstract currency. More stable because its usefulness is undeniable, As long as humans need to preserve food, salt has value, more volatile because it's consumable. Use salt for its intended purpose, and your currency disappears. It's money that evaporates with use, which creates interesting economic pressures. There's a story, possibly apocryphal, possibly true, the line is blurry this far back, about Roman soldiers being paid in salt and using it as currency among themselves, gambling with it, trading it for favors or goods until payday came around again. Whether this actually happened, or is just a neat narrative constructed by later historians trying to explain the word salary, is one of those delightful mysteries that will probably never be fully resolved. The evidence is contradictory, the sources are biased, and frankly, record-keeping wasn't exactly meticulous when it came to everyday soldier transactions. What is certain is that salt taxes existed, salt monopolies existed, and salt-based economies functioned across multiple continents for centuries. In China, salt taxes funded dynasties. In France, the gabelle, the salt tax, was so hated it contributed to revolutionary fervor. In Africa, salt routes crossed the Sahara, connecting Mediterranean civilizations to sub-Saharan kingdoms, with salt serving as both commodity and currency simultaneously. You're back on that Roman road now, watching the sun set behind the workers as they shoulder their loads again and continue their journey. The salt catches the light, glinting faintly, and for a moment it does look like something precious, something worth hauling across miles of stone road in Mediterranean heat. Your own salt intake is probably something you never think about. It's in everything, abundant, cheap, forgettable. Here, though, in this moment, salt is wealth. Salt is power. Salt is the thing that keeps civilizations running, and every crystalline block being carried toward Rome is simultaneously a paycheck, a tax payment, and a strategic resource. The workers disappear around a bend in the road, and you're left standing alone in the fading light, thinking about how value shifts across time. That container of table salt in your kitchen, the one you paid maybe $2 for, and will probably have for years, would have been worth a genuine fortune in the right time and place. The same substance, the same molecular structure, but the context transforms it from mundane to precious. It's a reminder that money is always at its core about scarcity and necessity, about what people need and what they're willing to exchange for it. The Roman road fades behind you, and suddenly the air is different, thicker, humid, scented with something rich and earthy. You're in a forest now, but not the kind you're used to. This is Mesoamerica, somewhere in the 15th century, and the trees around you are cacao trees, their trunks studded with pods that grow directly from the bark in a way that looks vaguely unsettling, like the tree is sprouting fruit from its torso. The pods are football-shaped, ranging from green to yellow to deep burgundy, and inside each one are the beans that will change how you think about chocolate forever. You're holding one of these beans right now. It's roughly the size of an almond, dark brown, slightly oily to the touch. It doesn't look like money. It doesn't look like much of anything, honestly. Just a seed, the kind of thing you'd probably ignore if you found it on a hiking trail. But here, in the Aztec Empire, this bean is currency. Literal, actual, government-recognized currency that you can use to buy food, cloth, services, or if you've saved enough of them, something really substantial like land or a slave. The exchange rates are specific, memorized by every merchant and farmer. One turkey costs 100 cacao beans. A rabbit is worth 30. A tamale goes for a single bean, which means you're holding the equivalent of $1 maybe, depending on how you calculate historical purchasing power. The marketplace you're walking through is crowded, noisy, full of vendors calling out their wares and customers haggling over prices. Everyone's counting beans. You watch a woman purchase fabric, carefully counting out beans one by one into the merchant's hand. 43, 44, 45. While he watches with the attentiveness of someone who knows exactly how easy it is to miscount. There's no paper money here, no coins, just these beans passing from palm to palm, accumulating in pouches and baskets, the literal seeds of commerce. Here's where it gets interesting, and by interesting we mean problematic. Cacao beans are organic. They rot. They mold. They get eaten by insects. They're perishable currency, which is possibly the worst combination of words in economic history. Imagine if your paycheck had an expiration date, if your savings account started decomposing after a few months. That's the reality here. Cacao beans last maybe a year if stored properly, less if the conditions are humid or if pests get involved. This creates an economy where hoarding is risky, where you need to keep your wealth circulating, where saving for retirement is complicated by the fact that your retirement fund might literally rot before you get to use it. And then there's the counterfeiting. Oh, the counterfeiting. Because here's the thing about cacao beans, they have shells. And if you're clever and dishonest, you can carefully open a bean, scoop out the valuable interior, fill it with mud or ground avocado pit, or basically anything with the right weight and texture, and seal it back up. Congratulations, you've just committed pre-Columbian financial fraud. The sources: Spanish chroniclers writing after the conquest, mostly, mention this happening, merchants complaining about fake beans, buyers checking their purchases carefully before accepting them. It's the ancient equivalent of checking if a $20 bill is counterfeit, except instead of holding it up to the light, you're probably breaking open random beans to make sure they're solid all the way through. You watch this happen now, actually. A merchant accepts a handful of beans from a customer, then immediately cracks one open with his thumbnail, checking the interior. It's real. He nods, satisfied, and hands over a small clay pot in exchange. The customer leaves, and you notice the merchant sets aside the broken beans separately. Can't use it as currency anymore once it's cracked, but the contents are still good for making the bitter chocolate drink that gives these beans their value in the first place. Nothing goes to waste in an economy where money is edible. The value of cacao beans isn't arbitrary. They don't grow everywhere. Cacao trees are particular about climate, needing tropical conditions with the right balance of rain and shade. The Aztecs couldn't grow them in the Valley of Mexico. They had to import them from lowland regions, which immediately made them scarce in the capital. Scarcity plus usefulness equals value, and cacao beans were definitely useful. Grind them up, mix them with water and spices, and you get zacatl, a drink that was consumed in rituals, served at feasts, associated with nobility and divine favor. So these beans are simultaneously money and luxury good, which creates some interesting economic feedback loops. There's a scholarly debate about exactly how widespread cacao currency was. Some historians argue it was the primary medium of exchange across the Aztec Empire. Others suggest it was more regional or limited to certain types of transactions. The Spanish sources we rely on were written by outsiders trying to understand an economy that operated on completely different principles from European systems. So there's probably some misunderstanding baked into the accounts. What's clear is that cacao was used as money, that exchange rates existed, that people understood its value and used it in transactions regularly. The specifics, how universal it was, whether it was the only currency or one of several. Those details get fuzzy. You're holding a small pouch now, given to you by a passing merchant who's explaining the economy with the patience of someone who's had to explain this to confused foreigners before. Inside are 100 beans. 1 turkey, he says, grinning, or 100 tamales, or 5 rabbits, or, he pauses, calculating, 1/20th of a slave if you're counting. The casual way he mentions this last option is jarring, a reminder that this economic system was embedded in a culture with practices that make modern observers deeply uncomfortable. Money is never neutral. It exists within social structures, and those structures include things we'd rather not think about. The beans click softly against each other as you jostle the pouch. They're surprisingly light. Carrying wealth in cacao form would be easier than carrying it in salt blocks, certainly easier than the stone money you'll encounter later in this journey. But it comes with anxiety that salt doesn't have, the constant awareness that your wealth might mold, might get infested with beetles, might literally decompose if you're not careful. It's like carrying wealth in meat form, if meat were individually countable and had standardized exchange rates. As the sun moves lower, you notice something else. People are drinking their money. Someone set up a stall where, for a handful of beans, you can get those same beans ground up and mixed into a frothy drink served in a clay cup. It's the equivalent of going to a bank, withdrawing cash, and immediately eating it. The drink is bitter, spiced with chili, not at all like the sweet hot chocolate you know. This is chocolate before sugar, before milk, chocolate as the Aztecs intended it. Harsh, stimulating, complicated. You drink it and feel the caffeine-like effects of theobromine kicking in, the slight buzz that made this drink popular with warriors before battle. The marketplace is quieting now as evening approaches. Vendors are counting their day's earnings, pouring beans from hand to hand, doing calculations in their heads. Some beans will be stored, saved, kept as wealth. Others will be traded tomorrow. Some will be planted, because these are seeds after all, and if you have enough of them and the right land, you can literally grow money, though it takes years for cacao trees to mature. It's an agricultural economy where the medium of exchange is also the crop, where farming and finance blur into the same activity. You set your pouch of beans down on a stone wall and watch them in the fading light. 100 chances to buy something. 100 edible, perishable, counterfeit able units of value. 100 seeds that mean different things depending on whether you're hungry, thirsty, saving for something expensive, or just trying to get through the week. Money that grows on trees, literally, and yet still manages to be scarce enough to function as currency. It's perhaps the most organic economy humanity has ever created, in every sense of that word. The humid air of Mesoamerica evaporates, replaced by something cooler, tinged with the smell of aging dairy and stone cellars. You're in northern Italy now, sometime in the Middle Ages, and you're standing in a bank. Except this bank doesn't have tellers or deposit slips or those little pens chained to counters. This bank has shelves. Massive shelves stretching from floor to ceiling, and on every shelf sit enormous wheels of cheese, each one easily 80 pounds, golden rinded, stamped with marks indicating origin and date. You're looking at a fortune in Parmigiano Reggiano, and you're beginning to understand that medieval banking was significantly more fragrant than modern finance. This is the Banco del Formaggio, the cheese bank, though that's not quite the official name, more what people call it when they need to explain the concept to confused outsiders. The cheese wheels around you aren't just food, they're collateral. They're assets. They're investment vehicles that appreciate with age, literally gaining value as they sit on these shelves, and the aging process works its slow, enzymatic magic. A freshly made wheel is worth something, sure, but a wheel that's been aging for 2 years, 3 years. That's where the real money is, assuming the aging process goes well, and you don't end up with a wheel that's developed the wrong kind of mold or cracked in unfortunate ways. You watch a monk, because of course it's monks running this operation, monks and their mysterious economic enterprises, carefully turning a wheel, examining its rind for any signs of problems. He makes a notation on a wax tablet, some accounting mark that indicates this particular wheel is still on track, still gaining value, still a solid investment. The monastery has been making cheese for centuries, perfecting the process, and they've figured out that these wheels function beautifully as currency because they have several key features. They're standardized in size and weight. They're durable enough to last years. They're easily recognizable. And most importantly, they have intrinsic value that actually increases over time. It's better than gold in some ways. Gold just sits there being gold, but cheese improves. The economics of cheese currency are delightfully weird. Farmers would bring their milk to the monastery, and instead of being paid in coins, they'd receive notes of credit backed by aging cheese. These notes could be traded, used to pay debts, exchanged for goods. The cheese itself sat in the cellars, appreciating, while paper representations of it circulated through the local economy. It's an early form of representative currency, except instead of being backed by gold reserves, it's backed by dairy products. The phrase, sound monetary policy, takes on new meaning when your reserve assets need to be rotated periodically and checked for proper rind development. You're holding one of these notes now, a piece of parchment that entitles the bearer to claim a specific wheel of cheese from the monastery's cellars. It lists the weight, the production date, the expected aging time. There's a wax seal, some Latin phrases you can't quite decipher, and a sense that this piece of paper is worth more than most people's annual income. Someone could use this to pay rent for months. Someone else could break it down, trade the note for several smaller notes representing portions of the wheel to make everyday purchases. The monastery acts as both bank and mint, issuing currency in dairy form and keeping meticulous records of who owns what. Here's where it gets even stranger. Merchants would sometimes pay their taxes in cheese. Not notes representing cheese, but actual wheels of the stuff, delivered to tax collectors who then had to figure out what to do with 80 pounds of aging Parmigiano Reggiano. Some of it got redistributed, some got aged further and resold, some presumably got eaten by bureaucrats who were really committed to their work. Tax season must have smelled amazing, in a pungent, overwhelming sort of way. The monks have developed an entire vocabulary around cheese banking. Different terms for wheels at different stages of aging, different grades of quality, different notations for wheels that are earmarked for specific purposes. You overhear 2 of them discussing a wheel that's been pledged as collateral for a loan. The borrower needs money now, puts up a 3-year-old wheel as security, and if they default, the monastery keeps the cheese. It's the medieval equivalent of using your car as collateral, except your car is made of fermented milk and will be even more valuable in a few years if nobody touches it. There's genuine scholarly debate about how widespread cheese currency was. The documentation is scattered, often contained in monastery records written in abbreviated Latin that requires specialist knowledge to decode properly. What's certain is that it happened. That cheese functioned as a store of value and medium of exchange in certain regions of northern Italy, particularly around the monasteries that produced high-quality, long-aging cheeses. Whether this was common practice or unusual enough to be remarkable, that's where historians start arguing, pulling out obscure account books and letters from merchants complaining about exchange rates. You walk along the shelves, reading the marks on various wheels. Each one is tagged with information: production date, expected completion date, current owner if it's been pledged or sold. Some wheels are marked with family crests, indicating they're part of a dowry, set aside to mature until a daughter reaches marriageable age. The parents commissioned these wheels when she was born, and by the time she's ready to marry, they'll have aged into valuable assets that can be traded for land, gold, or whatever else the marriage contract requires. It's long-term investment planning with dairy products. The temperature in the cellar is carefully controlled, the humidity monitored, the wheels rotated on a schedule that the monks guard as closely as any trade secret. Because here's the thing, cheese banking only works if the cheese is good. A wheel that ages poorly, that develops the wrong flavors or textures, that cracks or molds incorrectly, that's not just a ruined food product, it's a failed investment. The monastery's reputation, and by extension the value of all their cheese-backed currency, depends on consistent quality. They're not just cheesemakers, they're reserve bank managers, and the reserve needs to be maintained at precise standards. You notice interest being calculated in rinds. Literally, someone's written up a loan document where the interest payment is described as a portion of the rind value at maturity. It's creative accounting in the most literal sense, figuring out how to calculate compound interest when your principal is actively fermenting. The mathematics involved are actually sophisticated, requiring projections of aging rates, market conditions, quality outcomes. Medieval monks were apparently quite good at futures trading, even if they never called it that. As you leave the cellar, heading back up stone steps toward daylight, you pass a cart being loaded with wheels destined for market. These aren't currency anymore. They've been converted back into commodity form, ready to be sold and eaten rather than held as assets. Someone's portfolio is being liquidated, in the most literal sense. The wheels roll slightly as they're positioned in the cart, making soft thuds against the wood, and you realize you've been watching wealth being transported in a form that requires careful handling and good suspension. Outside, the Italian sun is bright and warm, and you can smell bread baking somewhere nearby, hear the sounds of market day beginning. Somewhere in this town, someone is accepting a cheese note as payment for a horse. Someone else is breaking a large note into smaller denominations to buy vegetables and cloth. A merchant is calculating exchange rates between cheese-backed notes and metal coins, working out conversion ratios in his head. And deep beneath the monastery, wheels of cheese sit in cool darkness, slowly becoming more valuable with each passing day, the world's strangest and probably most delicious form of financial security. The Italian countryside dissolves, and suddenly you're somewhere impassably distant, a Pacific island where the air tastes of salt and the palm trees bend in warm trade winds. You're in Hawaii, centuries before anyone called it that, and you're holding something so light it barely registers in your palm. It's a coil of red feathers, each one tiny, brilliant, gathered from specific birds and woven into a rope-like strand that measures maybe 2 feet long. This delicate construction, this collection of what looks like decorative fluff, is worth more than the land you're standing on. Worth more than a canoe. Worth, if you had enough of them, a human life. The feathers come from two birds, the Iwi and the O, both honeycreepers native to these islands, both bearing red feathers that were rarer than gold, more precious than any metal. The Iwi is relatively common. You might catch one if you're skilled and patient. But the O has yellow feathers mostly, with just a small tuft of red under each wing. Catching one bird might give you a dozen usable red feathers. Maybe. To make a single cloak for royalty required tens of thousands of feathers. Tens of thousands. The mathematics of this are staggering, and they help explain why feathered cloaks became the ultimate symbol of power and wealth. You watch a bird catcher working now, moving through the forest with practiced silence. He's using a technique that's been perfected over generations, sticky sap from the breadfruit tree smeared on branches where honeycreepers like to land. The bird lands, gets stuck, struggles. The catcher approaches carefully, plucks the feathers he needs, never all of them, just the red ones, and releases the bird. Or that's the ideal version anyway. The reality is messier. More birds die than survive, and the feather collectors know they're depleting a finite resource. There's an awareness here that this currency system is unsustainable, that each generation has fewer birds to work with, but the value system is so entrenched that stopping would be unthinkable. The feathers you're holding represent months of work. Months of dawn expeditions into the forest, hours of patient waiting, careful plucking, meticulous sorting. Red feathers are graded by quality. Some are too pale, some too small, some damaged. Only the best make it into the coils that serve as currency. These coils are called lehulu, and they function in an economy that's partly monetary, partly gift-based, partly bound up in social obligation, and prestige in ways that don't map cleanly onto modern economic systems. Here's the thing that makes feather currency fascinating and troubling simultaneously. Its value is tied directly to the extinction rate of the source species. As the birds become rarer, the feathers become more valuable. It's a doom spiral built into the economic model. More value drives more collection, drives more scarcity, drives more value. By the time Europeans arrive, the O will already be in decline. By the 20th century, it will be extinct, though whether that's due to feather collection or introduced disease or habitat loss, or all three, is something ornithologists still untangle. You're in a chief's house now, watching a transaction take place. A lesser chief is presenting coils of red feathers to a higher-ranking chief, part of a complex negotiation that involves marriage alliances, land use rights, and obligations that will bind families for generations. The feathers are displayed on woven mats, counted, examined. One of the coils is rejected. The color isn't quite right. A few feathers are damaged. It's not just currency changing hands. It's honor, prestige, mana, spiritual power, all wrapped up in these delicate constructions that weigh almost nothing but mean everything. The High Chief accepts the remaining coils with formal words, then redistributes some of them to his advisors, who will in turn redistribute portions to their own followers. Feather wealth doesn't accumulate the way gold does. It circulates, constantly moving through social networks, creating and reinforcing relationships. Hoarding feathers would be not just economically pointless, but socially disastrous. The value isn't in possession. It's in the giving, in the public display of wealth and generosity. It's an economy built on movement rather than storage. There's scholarly uncertainty about exactly how standardized feather currency was. Some researchers argue there were specific conversion rates, that you could calculate the value of land or canoes or pigs in terms of feather lengths. Others suggest the value was more fluid, dependent on context and social relationship, that trying to impose fixed exchange rates misunderstands how this economy actually functioned. The historical record is thin, no written accounts until Europeans arrived, by which time the system was already changing under contact pressure. We're reconstructing economic practices from oral histories, archaeological evidence, and the observations of outsiders who didn't always understand what they were seeing. What's undeniable is that wars were fought over feathers. Alliances formed and broke over access to bird-catching grounds. Chiefs rose and fell based partly on their ability to accumulate and distribute feather wealth. The famous feather cloaks, a hyla, that you see in museums now, protected behind glass, were more than ceremonial garments. They were wearable bank accounts, displays of wealth so extreme that only the highest-ranking chiefs could accumulate enough feathers to commission one. A full cloak represented years of collection from hundreds of birds. Wearing one was like walking around in a suit made of $100 bills, except even more ostentatious. You're holding a single feather now, separated from its coil. It's impossibly light, catching the breeze, nearly floating away from your fingers. The red is vivid, almost glowing in the tropical sun. This feather was part of a bird that spent its life in the forest canopy, feeding on nectar, existing in an ecological niche that evolved over millions of years. Now its currency, abstracted from its biological context, assigned value by human social systems that the bird couldn't possibly comprehend. There's something almost absurd about it, taking one of the most fragile, ephemeral parts of a bird and deciding it represents wealth, power, obligation. The bird catchers are heading back into the forest, carrying their supplies, the breadfruit sap, the careful tools for plucking feathers without damaging them, the knowledge of where different species nest and feed. They move quietly, these early morning specialists, because the work requires patience and stealth. Disturb the forest too much, and the birds scatter. Rush the process, and you damage the feathers. This is currency collection that can't be mechanized, can't be rushed, can't be optimized beyond a certain point. The rate of acquisition is limited by the bird's life cycles, by forest ecology, by the careful hands of collectors who know that their livelihood depends on not over-harvesting. As the sun climbs higher, you watch a completed coil being packaged for transport to another island. It's wrapped in protective bark cloth, treated with the reverence due to something valuable and fragile. The person carrying it will travel by canoe across open ocean, navigating by stars and swells, and the feathers will arrive intact if the voyage goes well. If it doesn't, if the canoe capsizes or gets blown off course, that wealth simply disappears, returns to the ocean, unrecoverable. It's currency with no insurance, no guarantee, no backup system beyond the skill of navigators and the mercy of the sea. The weight of what you're witnessing settles slowly. This is an economy built on beauty, on the brilliant red of specific birds, on the willingness of an entire culture to agree that these feathers matter more than almost anything else. It will collapse, eventually, as the birds disappear and the social structures change under colonization. But for now, in this moment, the system works because everyone participates in the collective fiction that feathers equal wealth. Which, when you think about it, isn't that different from any other currency? We all agree on what has value, and that agreement makes it real, at least until circumstances change and we have to agree on something else entirely. The island air thins and cools, replaced by the dry wind of continental Asia. You're on the Silk Road now, though calling it a road is generous. It's more a network of paths worn into desert and mountain by centuries of caravans, a shifting route that changes with politics and weather and the locations of functioning wells. The landscape around you is harsh, beautiful in that austere way deserts are, and you're walking alongside camels loaded with cargo that clinks and shifts with each step. But the most interesting cargo isn't silk or spices. It's tea, compressed tea bricks that are hard as wood, heavy as stone, and more valuable than either. You're holding one of these bricks now. It's roughly the size of a hardcover book, dark brown, compressed so tightly that you can barely make out individual tea leaves in the matrix. The surface has been stamped with characters indicating origin and quality, like a government seal on currency, which is essentially what this is. This brick weighs about 1 kilogram, and across much of Central Asia, Tibet, Mongolia, and parts of China, it's money. Literal, spendable, government-recognized currency that you can also, in a pinch, shave pieces off of and brew into tea. It's the ultimate dual-purpose asset. Your savings account doubles as emergency beverage supply. The compression process that creates these bricks is labor-intensive and specific. Tea leaves are steamed, mixed with binding agents, sometimes just water, sometimes other plant materials, and then pressed into molds under tremendous pressure. The resulting brick needs to be hard enough to survive months of transport on camelback, consistent enough in weight and quality to serve as standardized currency, yet still able to be broken apart when someone wants to actually use it as tea. Getting that balance right took centuries of refinement, and the workshops that produce high-quality bricks guard their techniques carefully. You watch a merchant examining a brick that someone's trying to use as payment. He scrapes a corner with his thumbnail, sniffs the residue, even bites the edge to test density. It's the medieval equivalent of holding a bill up to the light to check for watermarks. Tea bricks can be counterfeited, inferior leaves mixed with sawdust or other fillers, pressed into convincing shapes, stamped with fake seals. A skilled merchant can spot fakes by weight, smell, the way the compressed material feels against teeth. It's an art form, this authentication process, born from the necessity of not accepting worthless bricks in exchange for actual goods. The economic logic of tea bricks is surprisingly sound. Tea is consumable, yes, but it's not perishable the way cacao beans are. These compressed bricks can last years if stored properly, decades even, without significant degradation. They're portable. A camel can carry dozens of bricks, representing substantial wealth in a relatively compact form. They're divisible. You can break a brick into smaller pieces for making change, though this reduces the value slightly since broken bricks are harder to authenticate. And most importantly, they have intrinsic value across a huge geographic range. From the tea-producing regions of China to the nomadic cultures of Mongolia who practically lived on butter tea, everyone wanted these bricks. You're traveling with a caravan now, and the economics of the journey are fascinating. The tea bricks loaded on these camels were purchased in southern China, where tea is abundant and relatively cheap. The caravan is heading north and west, into regions where tea doesn't grow, where the climate is too harsh for the plant to survive. With each mile traveled, the bricks become more valuable. By the time this caravan reaches Mongolia or Tibet, the same brick that cost the equivalent of a few coins in China will be worth exponentially more. It's arbitrage in its purest form, buying low in one market, transporting to where it's scarce, selling high. The Tibetan economy, in particular, ran substantially on tea brick currency. Historical accounts, written by Chinese officials, Tibetan monks, European travelers, describe tea bricks being used for everything from buying livestock to paying taxes to compensating for crimes. A horse might cost 30 bricks. A yak might be 20. The exchange rates were well established, understood across the region, stable enough that you could do long-term planning in units of tea. Some scholars argue this was one of the most successful commodity currencies in history, functioning smoothly for centuries with minimal governmental intervention. Here's where the historical record gets interesting and contentious. Exactly how official was tea brick currency? Chinese sources describe government tea monopolies, official exchange rates, regulations about production and distribution. Tibetan sources emphasize the organic nature of the system, the way value emerged from genuine demand rather than governmental decree. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, a hybrid system where government regulation existed, but local practice often diverged from official policy. The tea bricks you're carrying exist in that ambiguous space between official currency and commodity money. You stop for the night at a caravanserai, one of those fortified rest stops that dot the Silk Road, offering shelter and water and a place to secure your goods against bandits. Inside, merchants are conducting business by lamplight, and you watch tea bricks changing hands in various transactions. Someone's buying grain, counting out 4 bricks in payment. Someone else is settling a gambling debt with a broken piece of brick, the size carefully estimated to represent the agreed amount. A Mongolian nomad is examining bricks, selecting ones to carry back to his people, where they'll be shaved into hot water mixed with butter and salt. A drink that's more soup than tea, but essential nutrition in a harsh climate. The brick in your hands has traveled further than most people of this era will ever go. Harvested in southern China, processed in a workshop, transported by river, and then overland, traded through multiple hands, each transaction adding to the history embedded in its compressed leaves. If you could read the story in this brick, it would tell you about supply chains, exchange rates, cultural preferences, the whole complex web of trade that connected distant civilizations who never fully understood each other, but managed to do business anyway. There's something elegant about the tea brick system that modern currency lacks. You can see and touch your wealth. You can, if truly desperate, convert it back into its original use, beverage, though doing so means literally consuming your assets. It's transparent in a way paper money isn't. Nobody needs to trust in government backing or believe in abstract representations of value. The brick is valuable because people want tea, and the brick is tea, compressed and portable. The value is self-evident, which removes layers of faith and trust that other monetary systems require. As night deepens and the caravanserai quiets, you're left holding this brick, feeling its weight, its solidity. Tomorrow the caravan continues north, carrying these bricks toward regions where they'll be even more valuable, where the local economy literally runs on compressed tea. And somewhere far behind, in the tea-producing regions of China, more leaves are being harvested, steamed, compressed, stamped, prepared for the long journey that transforms plants into currency. It's an economy that makes sense from root to transaction, where the medium of exchange is also the reason for exchange, where money and commodity are identical, inseparable, one and the same. The Silk Road dust settles, and you're back to beaches, but different ones this time. You're in ancient China, maybe around the Shang dynasty, and your fingers are cramping because you've been threading cowrie shells onto thin cords for what feels like hours. Each shell needs to be positioned just right, tight enough that the string doesn't sag, loose enough that you can still count them easily. The shells click against each other with a sound that's become the background music of commerce. A soft, rattling percussion that means money is moving, deals are being made, wealth is being counted out one shell at a time. You've threaded 40 shells so far. Your target is 100, which will create a standard monetary unit, a string worth a specific, agreed-upon amount. These aren't the same cowries you handled on the Maldives beaches earlier. Well, some of them might be. Cowries traveled vast distances through trade networks. But here in China, they've been integrated into a different economic system, one that's more centralized, more regulated, more concerned with standardization than the organic cowrie economies of Africa or South Asia. The Chinese have taken the cowrie concept and, in typical fashion, systematized it. The shells on your string are sorted by size and quality. There are inspectors whose entire job is grading cowries, rejecting ones that are too small or damaged or the wrong color. It's quality control for currency, except the currency started as living mollusks in tropical waters and now exists as standardized units in the accounting books of dynasty officials. The bureaucracy surrounding cowrie money is extensive. Records of how many strings were issued, where they came from, who owes what to whom. The Chinese invented accounting practices around these shells that wouldn't look entirely foreign to a modern bookkeeper, minus the computer, and adding a lot more physical counting. Your fingers find a rhythm now. Pick up shell, slide onto string, push down to join the others, repeat. It's meditative in a mind-numbing sort of way, and you understand why this work was often done by lower-status workers or family members during downtime. Making money, literally manufacturing currency, becomes a form of piecework, paid presumably in the very shells you're stringing together. There's something recursive about earning cowries by preparing cowries, getting paid in the currency you're actively creating. The historical record shows that cowrie currency in China dates back at least to the Shang dynasty, maybe earlier. Archaeological digs turn up cowrie shells in burial sites, sometimes thousands of them, representing the wealth of the deceased or provisions for the afterlife. The character for money in Chinese letter, is pictographic, based on the shape of a cowrie shell. Even after China moved to metal currency, after bronze coins and eventually paper money, the linguistic fossil remained. Every time someone writes about money in Chinese, they're referencing these shells, this ancient system that predated coins by centuries. You're in a marketplace now, your completed string of 100 shells looped over your arm. A vendor is selling cloth, and you watch as a customer pays with multiple strings, counting them out carefully while the vendor checks each one. The checking process involves running fingers down the string, feeling for irregularities, shells that are too small or too large, signs that someone's tried to cheat by adding inferior cowries. It's surprisingly difficult to counterfeit cowrie strings because each shell needs to be authentic, and authentic cowries have specific characteristics that are hard to fake. You can't carve them from wood and expect them to pass. The weight is wrong, the gloss is wrong, the whole thing is obviously fake to anyone who handles cowries regularly. But there are other ways to cheat the system. You can string 90 shells and claim it's 100. You can mix in damaged shells and hope nobody notices. You can use shells that are technically cowries, but not the specific species that's supposed to be used for currency. The variety of fraud attempts has led to the variety of checking methods, and honest merchants develop a practiced eye and touch that can spot problems instantly. It's analog security for analog currency, based on human skill rather than mechanical detection. The question historians debate is why China eventually moved away from Cowrie currency. The usual explanation is that shells became too scarce. They had to be imported from southern regions, and as the economy grew, the supply couldn't keep up with demand. This scarcity led to experiments with other materials, eventually resulting in bronze coins shaped like cowries, then coins with square holes in the center that could be strung together in deliberate echo of the earlier shell stringing practice. But some scholars argue the shift was more about centralization and control. Metal coins could be minted by the government, the supply regulated, the whole system brought under bureaucratic oversight in ways that Cowrie currency resisted. You're holding a late-period Cowrie now, one from the transition era when both shells and bronze were circulating simultaneously. It's been modified. Someone drilled a hole through it to make it easier to string, which was apparently common as the system evolved. The natural opening of the Cowrie wasn't always positioned conveniently for threading, so people adapted, drilling holes, sometimes multiple holes, creating shells that were more functional as currency and less natural as objects. It's a small detail, these drilled holes, but they represent the moment when the currency function completely overtook the natural form, when shells stopped being found objects and became manufactured monetary units. The sound of Cowrie strings is everywhere in this marketplace, vendors pouring them from hand to hand, counting, customers checking strings before accepting them, children playing a game that involves tossing strung shells, the winner determined by some rule you don't understand, but that clearly involves counting and chance. The shells have become so embedded in daily life that people manipulate them without looking, checking quality by touch alone, counting by the weight of a string across the palm. There's archaeological evidence that Cowrie hoards existed, people burying thousands of shells, either as savings or as grave goods, or for reasons that aren't entirely clear from context alone. These hoards get excavated centuries later, the shells still intact, still obviously valuable in their original context, even if meaningless to whoever digs them up. It's treasure that requires cultural knowledge to recognize as treasure. A pile of shells might be garbage or might be a fortune, depending entirely on when and where you're standing. You add your completed string to a growing collection, watching as they accumulate. Each string represents hours of threading work, months of shells traveling from collection points to market, centuries of economic evolution that turned beach debris into standardized currency. The system worked because everyone agreed it worked, because cowries had the right combination of features: durable, portable, recognizable, difficult to fake. And because the infrastructure grew up around them, the grading systems and stringing methods and checking practices that made shell currency practical at scale. As the market day ends and vendors pack up their goods, you notice someone counting their earnings by pouring strings from one basket to another, the shells creating a waterfall of clicking, rattling sound. It's the sound of liquid assets, quite literally. Shells that came from liquid, that flow like liquid when poured, that move through the economy with the fluidity that gives us the whole metaphor of currency flow. And somewhere in the background, someone's starting the evening's work of threading tomorrow's money, picking up shells one by one, sliding them onto cord, creating the currency that will facilitate tomorrow's transactions, continuing a practice that's already ancient and will persist for generations more before finally fading into history. The clicking of cowrie shells fades, replaced by the sound of waves against coral reefs. You're on Yap, a small island in Micronesia, and you're staring at what might be the most impractical currency ever invented. It's a stone disc, carved from limestone, roughly circular, with a hole through the center large enough to slide a wooden pole through for transport. This particular disc, called a rye stone, is about 8 feet in diameter and weighs somewhere around 4 tons. It's sitting in someone's front yard, partially overgrown with vegetation, looking for all the world like a decorative garden feature. Except it's not decoration. It's money. This absurdly large, utterly immovable rock is currency, and you're beginning to understand that sometimes the most interesting aspect of money is how ridiculous it can be while still functioning perfectly well. Here's the thing that breaks most people's understanding of currency. This stone doesn't need to move for ownership to change. The stone stays exactly where it is, in this yard, or on that beach, or wedged into a path where someone left it generations ago, and ownership just transfers conceptually. Everyone on the island knows who owns which stone. If you buy something with this 4-ton rye, you don't hire movers and laborers to drag it to the seller's property. You just announce the transfer. The stone stays put. The ownership changes. The transaction is complete. It's like cryptocurrency before computers, where the ledger exists in collective memory rather than blockchain, and the actual asset never moves because moving it would be absurd. You're watching an elder now, standing before a community gathering, announcing a transaction. He's speaking in the local language, but the meaning is clear enough from context. Ownership of a specific rye stone is transferring from one family to another. Payment for a marriage arrangement that's been negotiated for months. The stone in question isn't even visible from here. It's somewhere across the island, or maybe on a different island entirely. Nobody seems concerned about this. The elder points in the general direction, describes the stone's characteristics, its size, where it came from, which voyage brought it here, and everyone nods. The transaction is validated by collective witness, recorded in communal memory, as binding as any contract signed in triplicate. The stones come from Palau, an island group about 250 miles away. They're carved from limestone quarries there, shaped into discs, and this is where it gets really interesting, transported by canoe across open ocean. Picture this. You've carved a 4-ton limestone disc. You've somehow gotten it to the beach. You've loaded it onto an outrigger canoe, which is honestly a feat of engineering that doesn't get enough credit. And then you sail 250 miles across the Pacific, hoping the weather holds, hoping the canoe doesn't capsize, hoping you don't encounter any of the numerous disasters that could send your currency, your massive, irreplaceable stone currency, straight to the ocean floor. And here's where it gets even stranger. There's a famous story, documented by various anthropologists and repeated in economic discussions, about a rye stone that sank during transport. The canoe capsized, the stone went down in deep water, irretrievable. But the family still claimed ownership of it. The stone existed somewhere on the ocean floor, and everyone agreed it was valuable, that it still belonged to that family, that it could still be used in transactions. Ownership of a stone nobody could see, that nobody would ever see again, sitting in permanent darkness at the bottom of the Pacific, and people accepted this. The stone was used as currency for generations, changing hands in transactions, despite being thoroughly and permanently inaccessible. You're standing near a particularly large rye now, one that's maybe 12 feet across, so massive that it clearly hasn't moved since it was placed here decades or centuries ago. The limestone has weathered, darkened, developed a pattern of age and exposure. Moss grows in the carved grooves. Small plants have taken root in accumulated soil in the center hole. This stone has become part of the landscape, and yet it's also someone's wealth, an asset on an invisible balance sheet maintained by collective knowledge and oral tradition. The value of rye stones isn't determined just by size, though size matters. What really affects value is the stone's history, the difficulty of the voyage that brought it here, the lives lost in the quarrying or transport, the prestige of the families involved in its creation. A smaller stone from a particularly dangerous voyage might be worth more than a larger stone from an easier trip. A stone associated with historical events, with important transactions in the past, accrues value beyond its physical properties. It's like provenance for artwork, except the artwork is a multi-ton rock, and the gallery is an entire island. There's scholarly debate about whether rye stones were actually everyday currency or primarily prestige items used for major transactions like marriages, peace agreements, and political alliances. Some anthropologists argue they functioned like large bills. You wouldn't use a rye for buying fish. You'd use smaller currencies like shells or woven goods. But for major purchases, rye stones were the standard. Others suggest they were more like assets than currency, stores of wealth that could be referenced in transactions without being the actual medium of exchange. The distinction gets blurry because the Yepes economy operated on principles that don't map cleanly onto Western economic categories. You watch a younger man gesturing to various stones scattered around the village, explaining their ownership history to someone. His hands trace the genealogy. This stone came from that family, was transferred in a marriage 3 generations ago, was used to settle a dispute 2 generations ago, currently belongs to this lineage. He's reciting a ledger from memory, maintaining the oral record that makes this whole system functional. If the memory fails, if the community forgets who owns what, the entire monetary system collapses. It's dependent on social cohesion, shared knowledge, and collective agreement in ways that make central banking look simple by comparison. The physical characteristics of the stones contribute to their security as currency. You can't counterfeit a rye stone. The limestone comes from specific quarries in Palau, has specific properties, looks and feels distinct from other types of stone. You can't secretly move a rye. It's too large, too heavy, and besides, everyone knows where all the stones are. You can't steal one in any meaningful sense because ownership isn't determined by possession, but by social consensus. The security isn't in locks or vaults, it's in collective memory and community acknowledgement. When Europeans first encountered rye stone currency, they were baffled. It violated every principle of currency they understood. Money should be portable. These stones were immovable. Money should be secured by possession. These stones' ownership was independent of location. Money should have intrinsic value. These stones were just limestone, not particularly useful for anything except being large and historically significant. The Europeans tried to map rye stones onto their existing economic frameworks, and failed, which says more about the limitations of those frameworks than about the functionality of rye stones. As evening approaches, the stones take on different character in the changing light. They cast long shadows, their circular forms and center holes creating distinctive patterns on the ground. You're struck by how permanent they seem, how rooted in place, and yet how fluid their ownership is. The stones are fixed points around which an economy flows, unchanging physical objects that nonetheless represent constantly shifting values and relationships. It's money that exists in 2 states simultaneously, utterly static and completely dynamic. You place your hand on one of the stones, feeling the rough limestone, the warmth retained from the day's sun. This rock is wealth, is currency, is stored value, is cultural heritage, is artistic expression, is engineering achievement, is all of these things simultaneously. It's too heavy to steal, too large to lose, too distinctive to counterfeit, too public to hide. It might be the most secure form of currency ever invented, secured not by technology or force, but by the simple fact that everyone knows where every stone is and who owns it. Sometimes the best security system is just having everyone pay attention. The limestone giants of Yap fade behind you, and suddenly you're holding something much smaller, much smoother, curved like a crescent moon and polished to an ivory sheen. It's a whale tooth, specifically a sperm whale tooth. And in Fiji, where you're standing now with warm Pacific water lapping at your ankles, this single tooth is worth more than most people will earn in years of work. It's called a tabua, and it's simultaneously currency, ceremonial object, diplomatic tool, and status symbol. You're beginning to sense a pattern in these island economies. They take something rare from the ocean and decide it's valuable, and then build entire social structures around that decision. The tooth in your hand is surprisingly heavy, solid, about 6 inches long and gently curved. It's been polished smooth, worn by handling, rubbed with coconut oil until it gleams. There's a braided cord attached to one end, traditionally made from coconut fiber, that allows it to be worn or carried or presented in formal ceremonies. This isn't just money you can spend at a market. This is high-denomination currency, the kind you use for major life events, marriages, funerals, peace treaties, apologies for serious offenses. Using a tabua for everyday transactions would be like trying to buy groceries with a bar of gold. Technically possible, but missing the point entirely. You're in a village, watching a presentation ceremony. A man approaches an elder, carrying a tabua wrapped in sacred cloth. He kneels, unwraps the tooth with deliberate formality, and presents it with both hands while speaking in a ritual language you don't fully understand but can feel the weight of. The elder accepts it gravely, examining the tooth, checking authenticity, yes, but also acknowledging the gesture, the respect being shown, the relationship being acknowledged or repaired or initiated. The tabua changes hands, and something intangible but crucial has shifted in the social fabric of the village. Here's where whale tooth currency gets complicated. Not all teeth are equal. A genuine sperm whale tooth, taken from a whale that washed ashore or was hunted traditionally, has maximum value. But tabua are rare. Whales don't conveniently provide their teeth on demand, and demand for tabua far exceeds natural supply. So alternatives emerged. Teeth from other whales, less valuable but still significant. Carved bone, shaped to resemble teeth, which everyone knows aren't real but might be accepted in less formal contexts. And then, most controversially, imported whale teeth brought by European traders, which created economic chaos, because suddenly the supply of what should be rare currency increased dramatically. You watch a village elder examining a tabua that someone's trying to use in a transaction. He's suspicious. The size is slightly off, the color not quite right, the wear patterns inconsistent with age. His fingers know what genuine whale ivory feels like, the specific density and temperature and texture. After a long examination, he rejects it. The would-be presenter withdraws, embarrassed. Authentication is everything when your currency can be counterfeited with sufficient carving skill and the right materials. Unlike rye stones that are too large to fake, tabua are small enough that fraud is possible, which means communities develop expert authenticators whose judgment carries significant weight. The economic function of tabua is inseparable from their social function. You can't just buy a tabua and then immediately use it. Well, you can, but it's considered crude, lacking in proper respect. Ideally, tabua should have history, should have passed through important transactions, should carry stories of previous exchanges. A tabua that was used to seal a famous peace agreement generations ago is worth more than a fresh tooth of the same size and quality. The provenance matters, the narrative matters, the social memory embedded in the object matters. There's fascinating historical documentation about how European contact disrupted the tabua economy. Traders arrived with ship holds full of whale teeth, acquired from whaling operations in other oceans, and attempted to trade them for valuable goods. Initially, this worked. Fijians accepted the teeth, and traders got favorable deals. But the flood of new teeth caused what economists would call inflation. When tabua became more common, their individual value decreased. What once might have secured an important alliance might now only settle a minor dispute. Some communities tried to distinguish between traditional teeth with known histories and trade teeth from unknown sources, but enforcing such distinctions proved difficult. You're holding two tabua now, side by side for comparison. One is darkened with age, worn smooth by generations of handling, its cord frayed and replaced multiple times. The other is whiter, newer, its surface less polished, its cord fresh. The older tooth would command more respect in ceremonies, even though the newer one is technically more pristine. It's the inverse of most currency systems, where newer is better, where worn bills get replaced. Here, the where is the point, the evidence of circulation through important transactions, the physical manifestation of social history. The question of whether tabua are money in the conventional sense divides scholars. Some argue they're gifts rather than currency, operating in a gift economy where the goal isn't profit but relationship maintenance. Others insist they function as currency. They're used to settle debts, compensate for offenses, pay for services and goods, just in contexts that are more formalized and ceremonial than casual marketplace transactions. The truth probably depends on how you define money, whether you require a medium of exchange functionality or accept store of value and unit of account roles as sufficient. You watch a funeral taking place, and tabua are being presented to the deceased's family by various community members. Each presentation comes with formal words, acknowledgement of relationship, expression of respect and grief. The teeth accumulate before the family, 3, 5, 7, 10, each one representing not just material value but social connection, obligation acknowledged, status recognized. Later, the family will redistribute some of these teeth, fulfilling their own obligations, maintaining the circulation that keeps the system functioning. The teeth have taken on an almost luminous quality in the late afternoon light, their polished surfaces catching the sun. You're struck by how something that came from an animal's mouth, that served as teeth for catching prey in deep ocean waters, has been transformed into objects of such loaded significance. The whale that grew these teeth had no concept of value, no idea that its dental equipment would become currency, ceremony, and social glue for human communities thousands of miles from its hunting grounds. There's a poignancy to whale tooth currency that's hard to articulate. These teeth represent dead whales, whether beached, hunted, or dying of natural causes at sea. Each tabua is a memorial to a creature that was, by any measure, magnificent, the largest toothed predator on Earth, capable of diving thousands of feet deep, navigating by echolocation, living complex social lives we're only beginning to understand. And humans took their teeth and made them into symbols, into objects that carry human meaning and human value, completely abstracted from their original biological function. As the sun sets and the ceremony concludes, you're left holding a single tabua, feeling its weight, its smoothness, the centuries of social meaning compressed into this one curved piece of ivory. It's currency that works only if everyone understands the context, only if the social structures remain intact, only if the collective memory of which teeth matter and why remains functional. It's money that's also ritual object, that's also diplomatic tool, that's also art. It's everything at once, which makes it either the most sophisticated currency ever invented or not really currency at all, depending on how narrowly you want to define the term. The spice where houses fade, replaced by thin mountain air and the sound of, well, bells. You're in the Swiss Alps, sometime in the medieval period, and the sound is everywhere. A deep, resonant clanging that echoes off the mountains, each bell with its own pitch and timbre. You're standing in a valley watching cattle graze on impossibly steep slopes, and around the neck of each cow hangs a large bronze bell. These aren't just practical tools for locating livestock in fog, though they serve that purpose. These bells are wealth. These bells are inheritance. These bells are, in the most literal sense, assets that can be tallied on balance sheets, used as collateral for loans, transferred as dowry payments, and divided among heirs in wills. You're looking at a herd of walking currency, each animal decorated with its own bronze bank account. The bells themselves are substantial. 10, 15, 20 pounds of cast bronze, shaped into specific forms that have been refined over generations. Each one is unique, cast individually in sand molds, and the casting process requires genuine skill. Bronze is expensive, the labor is specialized, and the result is an object that's nearly indestructible, distinctive in sound and appearance, and impossible to secretly replicate. You can't forge a cowbell the way you might counterfeit a coin. The casting process, the size, the weight, the specific tone, all of these create a kind of authentication that's baked into the object itself. You're watching a bell maker now, working in a workshop that's been in his family for generations. He's pouring molten bronze into a mold, the metal glowing orange-red, radiating heat. When it cools and the mold is broken away, a bell will emerge, rough cast and ready for finishing. The sound won't be quite right yet. That requires grinding, filing, adjusting the thickness in precise ways until the tone matches what's needed. Because the tone matters. Each bell has its own voice, and that voice identifies which family it belongs to, which herd it's part of. In thick fog, when visibility is nothing, farmers identify their cattle by the sound of their bells alone. The economic function of cowbells is tied up with Swiss inheritance practices and property law in ways that seem strange from outside the culture. Bells are passed down through families, often with specific rules about which child inherits which bells. They're listed in wills alongside land and buildings. They serve as dowry. A bride might bring several valuable bells into a marriage, representing her family's contribution to the new household. The bells have names, sometimes, recorded in family documents along with their lineage, which bells came from which ancestors, which ones were cast for special occasions. Here's where it becomes explicitly financial. Bells can be used as collateral for loans. If you need to borrow money, you can pledge your bells. Their value is understood, assessed based on size, quality, age, provenance. The lender might physically hold the bells during the loan period, or they might remain with the borrower with a legal claim attached. Default on the loan and you lose the bells, which means you lose both their practical utility and their symbolic/financial value. It's using livestock decoration as banking collateral, which sounds absurd until you remember that we use houses and cars the same way. You're examining a particularly old bell now, one that's been in use for maybe 2 centuries. The bronze has developed a deep patina, green and brown, worn smooth in places by weather and time, and the rubbing of the rope that attaches it to cattle. The bell maker points out details, the casting quality, the decoration around the rim, the specific proportions that create its distinctive tone. He rings it once, and the sound is deep, pure, carrying across the valley. "That tone," he says, "belongs to the Muller family. Everyone knows it." The bell is signature, currency, and property marker all at once. The value of cowbells isn't arbitrary. They require valuable materials. Bronze is copper and tin, both of which must be acquired through trade. They require skilled labor. You can't just pour bronze into any shape and get a functional bell. They're durable but not indestructible. A bell can crack if damaged badly, rendering it worthless or forcing expensive repair. And they're genuinely useful. In alpine terrain, where cattle graze over large areas in difficult visibility, bells serve a real practical function. This combination of material cost, labor cost, durability, and utility creates stable value. There's limited scholarly documentation of cowbells as formal currency, which is partly because they operated in local, traditional economies that didn't generate extensive written records. What exists are references in wills, property transfers, loan documents, court cases about inheritance disputes, scattered evidence that bells had recognized financial value beyond their practical use. Whether they circulated as currency in the sense of changing hands frequently for various transactions, or functioned more as stored wealth that occasionally entered the market, is unclear. The truth probably varied by region and time period. You're at a wedding now, watching the formal exchange of property that accompanies the marriage ceremony. Among the items being transferred, recorded by a notary, witnessed by community members, are 4 cowbells, each described in detail. Their weight, their tone, their decoration, their history. The bells represent significant value, enough that they merit this formal documentation, this public acknowledgement. Later, these bells will hang from the couple's cattle, marking their herd as theirs, but also serving as stored value, emergency assets that could be sold or pledged if necessary. The sound environment these bells create is remarkable. In a valley with multiple herds, each bell contributes its note to a constant, overlapping symphony of bronze. The effect is somehow both chaotic and harmonious, each bell recognizable to trained ears, the overall sound becoming the acoustic signature of alpine pastoral life. It's music created by moving wealth, currency that announces itself constantly, property that can't be quietly stolen because it makes noise with every step the cattle take. The authentication problem with cowbells is interesting because bells are both easy and hard to copy. Easy in the sense that anyone with bronze casting ability could make something bell-shaped. Hard in the sense that replicating a specific bell's exact tone, size, decoration, and patina is extremely difficult. Bells are like fingerprints, similar overall, but unique in details. An experienced bell maker or cattle farmer can identify specific bells by sight and sound, spotting counterfeits or stolen goods. The community knowledge serves as authentication system, distributed security based on collective expertise. As the day ends and cattle are brought down from higher pastures for the night, the sound of bells intensifies. Dozens of animals, dozens of bells, creating a clanging procession down the mountain paths. You watch wealth literally walking home, bronze assets being secured for the night in barns and enclosures. Each bell represents hours of skilled labor, pounds of valuable metal, family history, potential collateral value. They're heavy, impractical, noisy, and yet perfectly suited to their context. An economy where livestock is central, where sound carries across mountains, where durability matters more than portability. You hold a bell one last time, feeling its weight, substantial, cold, solid. The bronze has a density that feels permanent, trustworthy. Ring it, and the sound is clear, carrying, unmistakable. This is currency you can hear from a mile away, wealth that announces itself, money that serves double duty as practical tool and stored value. In an environment where these specific qualities matter, where livestock wanders, where fog obscures, where durability across generations is valued, cowbells make perfect sense as a form of wealth. They're adapted to their context as precisely as any currency ever invented, proof that money takes whatever form a community needs it to take, even if that form weighs 20 pounds and rings like a church bell every time it moves. The alpine valleys flatten and warm dramatically, and suddenly you're in Central Africa, standing in blazing heat with red dust under your feet and the smell of dry earth all around. You're in the region that will eventually be called the Congo or parts of Zambia, but those names don't exist yet in this pre-colonial moment. What exists is a sophisticated trade network, complex kingdoms, and in your hands, you're holding something that looks like a giant letter X made of copper. It's heavy, maybe 2 pounds of pure copper, cast in a distinctive crossbar shape with splayed ends. This is a Katanga cross, and it's one of the most standardized, widely accepted currencies in pre-colonial Africa, facilitating trade across thousands of square miles long before Europeans arrived and started presuming that complex African economies didn't exist. The cross in your hands is remarkably uniform in size and weight. That's the first thing that strikes you. This isn't rough, variable, primitive currency. This is precisely standardized, showing evidence of sophisticated production systems and quality control. The crosses measure about 8 to 10 inches across, weigh between 1 and 2 kilograms, and their distinctive X shape is instantly recognizable. The copper has been smelted, refined, cast into these specific forms following patterns that remain consistent across vast geographic regions and long time periods. This is industrial-scale currency production happening in societies that European sources, for centuries, claimed had no sophisticated economic systems. You're watching a copper smelting operation now, and it's technically impressive in ways that challenge comfortable narratives about technological development. Workers are using furnaces that reach temperatures high enough to smelt copper ore, separating pure metal from rock. The process requires knowledge of metallurgy, understanding of temperature control, ability to assess ore quality, and coordinated labor. The molten copper is poured into molds, those distinctive X shapes, and allowed to cool. What emerges is currency, ready to circulate, standardized enough that someone 300 miles away will accept it at face value. The Katanga cross is circulated across enormous territories: modern Democratic Republic of Congo, Zambia, parts of Angola. Different ethnic groups, different languages, different political systems, but the crosses were universally recognized and accepted. They're found archaeologically in such wide distribution that they clearly served as common currency for inter-regional trade. This is monetary union before anyone called it that. Economic integration across diverse cultures, functioning smoothly without central banks or unified governments enforcing standardization. Here's what scholars have documented, pieced together from archaeological evidence, oral histories, and early European accounts. Katanga crosses functioned as currency for major transactions. Buying slaves, and we have to acknowledge this uncomfortable reality, typically involved crosses. Purchasing land, cattle, marriage payments, compensation for serious offenses, these used crosses. Smaller transactions used other currencies, beads, cloth, salt, but for major economic activity, copper crosses were the standard. Exchange rates existed. Sources suggest one cross might equal a certain amount of salt or a specific quantity of cloth, though exact rates probably fluctuated by time and place. You're in a marketplace, watching a transaction. Someone is purchasing cattle, counting out crosses one by one. The seller examines each cross carefully. Checking weight by hand, practiced hands can detect discrepancies surprisingly accurately, inspecting the copper for purity, assessing condition. A cross that's been damaged, had chunks broken off for smaller transactions, or shows signs of impurity is worth less. The crosses are currency, but they're also copper, useful metal that can be melted down and worked into tools, jewelry, ceremonial objects. This dual function creates interesting economics. Use a cross as money and it retains value. Melt it down and you get useful metal, but you've destroyed its monetary premium. The shape of the cross is, that distinctive X, serves multiple functions. It's instantly recognizable, impossible to confuse with anything else. It's relatively difficult to make without proper metalworking knowledge, providing some anti-counterfeiting security. The splayed ends make them stackable for storage and transport. You can pile crosses into neat arrangements that won't easily tumble. And some scholars suggest the shape had ceremonial or symbolic significance, though the specifics are debated and probably varied across cultures that used them. There's fascinating scholarly debate about exactly how old the Katanga cross system is. Some argue it developed relatively late, maybe 15th, 16th century, possibly influenced by European trade. Others point to evidence suggesting much earlier origins, perhaps centuries before significant European contact. The crosses themselves aren't easily dated. Copper doesn't decay like organic materials, and without context, a cross from 1300 looks like a cross from 1700. Archaeological context helps, but many crosses were found in circumstances that don't allow precise dating. This uncertainty matters for historical narratives about African economic sophistication and technological development. You're holding a stack of crosses now, feeling their combined weight, 20 pounds of copper, representing serious wealth. Someone's savings, accumulated over years, or someone's payment for major purchase, or inheritance divided among heirs. The copper is dull red-brown, oxidized but still clearly copper, still recognizably valuable. Each cross has slight variations. No two are perfectly identical, but they're close enough that standardization is evident. This is mass production, quality control, economic infrastructure functioning at scale. The documentation of Katanga crosses by early European explorers is complicated by their biases and misunderstandings. Some accounts dismiss them as primitive currency. Others are patronizingly surprised that Africans had sophisticated monetary systems. Very few early sources treat the crosses as what they clearly were, evidence of complex, functioning economies with developed financial instruments. Modern archaeology and economic anthropology have had to reconstruct what the crosses meant and how they functioned, often working against narratives established by colonial-era sources that had political motivations to diminish African achievement. The decline of Katanga crosses as currency came with colonization. European powers imposed their own monetary systems, suppressed indigenous currencies, disrupted trade networks that had functioned for centuries. Crosses continue to have value as copper, but their monetary function diminished. Today, they're found in museums, in archaeological collections, sometimes still held by families as cultural heritage objects. They're beautiful, in a functional sort of way. These X-shaped copper ingots that facilitated trade, stored wealth, connected communities across vast distances. You set the crosses down carefully. They're heavy, awkward to carry in quantity, which is probably why major transactions required physical presence or trusted intermediaries. You can't send crosses through the mail because mail doesn't exist here. Can't transfer them electronically, obviously. Can't do anything except physically transport copper from one location to another. This creates economic friction, but also security. Stealing crosses requires physically taking substantial weight of metal, making theft challenging and conspicuous. As the sun sets, casting long shadows across the red earth, you think about historical narratives, about whose economic systems get remembered and whose get forgotten or dismissed. The Katanga crosses represent sophisticated economic organization, standardized currency, quality control, wide acceptance across diverse groups, sustained production over long time periods. These are markers of complex society, of economic development, of technological capability. They existed for centuries before Europeans arrived and started presuming that African economies were simple or primitive. The crosses are evidence, physical and undeniable, that currency innovation happened everywhere humans needed to facilitate trade, regardless of what later narratives would claim about technological or economic development. The African landscape dissolves into humid heat of a different kind, and you're standing in colonial Virginia again. But this time, you're not salvaging nails from burned houses. You're in a tobacco field, looking at rows of plants taller than you are, their broad leaves drooping in the sticky summer air. These plants, Nicotiana tabacum, if you want the scientific name, are currency. Not metaphorically valuable, not eventually convertible to money valuable, but literally accepted as payment right now currency. You can pay your taxes in tobacco. You can pay your workers in tobacco. You can settle debts, buy land, purchase enslaved people. Though acknowledging this use makes clear how currency is never morally neutral, all in dried tobacco leaves. The entire colonial economy runs on a plant that people smoke, and the contradictions inherent in that system are about to become very clear. You're holding a bundle of cured tobacco leaves, tied together, weighing maybe 50 pounds. This bundle represents a specific value, understood and accepted throughout the Virginia colony and neighboring regions. Exchange rates between tobacco and British pounds sterling are published, regulated, adjusted periodically. There's genuine governmental oversight, inspectors who grade tobacco quality, warehouses where tobacco is stored and receipts issued, laws governing what can and cannot be used as currency tobacco. It's formalized, systematized, about as official as currency gets without being minted metal. Here's where tobacco currency gets problematic in ways that are simultaneously predictable and absurd. Tobacco is a plant. It molds. It dries out too much and crumbles. It gets infested with insects. It can rot, decay, be damaged by moisture or pests or time. Your savings account is literally decomposing, slowly but inevitably, which creates pressure to keep wealth moving, to convert tobacco into other forms of value before it becomes worthless. It's the opposite of gold sitting unchanged in vaults for centuries. This is wealth with an expiration date, currency that ages badly. You're in a tobacco inspection warehouse now, watching the grading process. Inspectors open bundles, examine leaves for quality, color, texture, freedom from mold or damage, whether it's been properly cured. Tobacco is sorted into grades, with higher quality commanding better rates. You can't just grow any tobacco and expect it to be accepted as currency. It has to meet standards, pass inspection, be certified as worth its designated value. Tobacco that fails inspection might still be sellable as low-grade product, but it won't be accepted for tax payments or major transactions. Quality control for currency, except the currency is organic and can literally go bad if you're not careful. The historical documentation around tobacco currency is extensive because it was official colonial policy, generating paperwork, laws, court cases, disputes. The Virginia House of Burgesses passed detailed regulations. Governors issued proclamations about exchange rates. Tax collectors recorded receipts in pounds of tobacco. We know how this system functioned because it was formalized, bureaucratized, embedded in governmental structures in ways that more informal commodity currencies weren't. But here's the truly strange part. Tobacco currency could be smoked. If you had tobacco you didn't need for transactions, or if you were desperate, or if you just wanted to, you could literally smoke your money. It's currency with alternative use, and that alternative use involves setting it on fire and inhaling the smoke. The economic implications are bizarre. Every time someone smokes tobacco, they're destroying currency, removing it from circulation, reducing the money supply one pipe full at a time. It's like burning dollar bills for warmth, except it's socially acceptable and actually the intended use of the product. You're watching a payment transaction now. Someone's paying wages to laborers, counting out tobacco by weight. The workers accept it without question. This is how they're always paid. Later, some of this tobacco will be used for transactions, some will be converted to other forms of wealth, and some will definitely be smoked. The lines between currency and commodity blur completely. It's money that's also a drug, a stimulant that people are physiologically addicted to, which creates interesting economic dynamics around demand. The quality variation in tobacco currency was a constant source of disputes. Someone pays a debt in low-quality tobacco. The recipient objects, they end up in court arguing about whether moldy tobacco counts as full value payment. Laws get passed trying to establish minimum quality standards, but enforcement is difficult because quality assessment is subjective, and tobacco continues to degrade after inspection. What passed inspection last month might be moldy this month. Your currency is literally rotting in storage, losing value not through inflation, but through organic decay. There's scholarly discussion about whether tobacco currency was brilliant adaptation to circumstances or disaster waiting to happen. On one hand, tobacco was Virginia's major export crop, universally produced, constantly in demand. Using it as currency made sense given metal coin scarcity. On the other hand, basing your entire monetary system on a perishable agricultural product that's subject to crop failures, quality variations, and literal decomposition seems economically unstable. Both perspectives have merit, which is probably why the system eventually transitioned away from tobacco toward more conventional currency, though that transition took decades. You're in a tobacco warehouse that functions essentially as a bank. Farmers deposit tobacco, receive receipts that specify quantity and quality, and those receipts can be traded as representative currency. The warehouse stores the actual tobacco, carefully, in conditions meant to minimize deterioration, while paper representations circulate. It's tobacco-backed currency, predating gold-backed currency in American history, and functioning on similar principles. The paper has value because it's redeemable for the physical commodity held in storage. The taxation system creates perverse incentives. You owe taxes in tobacco, so you grow tobacco to pay taxes, but growing tobacco requires labor, and you pay labor in tobacco, which means you need to grow more tobacco to pay the labor that grows the tobacco for taxes. It's a circular system where tobacco generates the need for more tobacco. And because tobacco depletes soil nutrients rapidly, you need new land constantly, which drives expansion, which drives conflict with indigenous peoples, which drives more need for tobacco to fund the colonial apparatus. The currency choice shapes the entire colonial project. You're examining a bundle of tobacco leaves closely now, and they're surprisingly beautiful in a dried plant sort of way, varying shades of brown and gold, the leaves veining visible, the texture of properly cured tobacco distinctive. But they're also clearly organic, clearly fragile, clearly temporary. This is wealth that will not last, that requires constant vigilance to maintain, that ages and degrades and eventually becomes worthless even if you do everything right. The fire risk alone must have been terrifying. Your entire savings, your tax payments, your stored wealth, all of it highly flammable, stored in wooden warehouses, in an era when fire control was primitive and accidental fires were common. A warehouse fire doesn't just destroy property, it destroys currency, wipes out wealth for everyone who had tobacco stored there. It's a bank failure where the failure involves literal flames. As evening approaches and you leave the warehouse, the smell of curing tobacco follows you, sweet, slightly acrid, unmistakable. Somewhere nearby, someone is smoking their money, converting wealth into pleasure and addiction. Someone else is loading tobacco onto ships bound for England, converting colonial currency into sterling through international trade. Someone else is watching their stored tobacco and worrying about mold, about insects, about all the ways organic currency can fail. The tobacco fields stretch to the horizon, rows of plants that are simultaneously crop and currency, agricultural product, and economic foundation. It's wealth you can literally watch grow, which has a directness that modern currency lacks. But it's also wealth you can watch die, watch deteriorate, watch fail. Every currency system has vulnerabilities, but most don't involve fungal decay and beetle infestation. Tobacco currency worked because circumstances made it necessary, and demand made it valuable, but it worked despite obvious flaws, despite being possibly the least stable form of money ever officially adopted by a government. Sometimes desperation makes bad ideas seem workable, and sometimes they actually work, at least for a while, at least until something better comes along. The tobacco fields fade, replaced by something smaller, more colorful, and infinitely more complicated. You're holding a string of glass beads, each one may be the size of a pea, in colors that shouldn't exist in nature: electric blue, brilliant red, emerald green. They're Venetian trade beads, manufactured in the glass workshops of Murano. and they've traveled thousands of miles from Italy to Africa to the Americas, facilitating trades that historians still argue about, still try to untangle, still struggle to discuss without either sanitizing or oversimplifying. These beads were currency, yes, but they were currency in contexts that involve colonization, slavery, exploitation, and power imbalances that make them impossible to discuss neutrally. The beads themselves are beautiful in an objective sense. Tiny spheres of colored glass, sometimes striped, sometimes solid, sometimes with complex internal patterns created by skilled glassworkers who spent lifetimes perfecting techniques. The glass is smooth, uniform, carefully crafted. These aren't crude objects. They're products of sophisticated manufacturing, created by artisans who understood chemistry, heat, color, form. Each bead required fuel for furnaces, imported materials for certain colors, specialized knowledge passed through guilds. Their technological achievements, which makes their use in deeply problematic trades even more complicated to process. You're watching a transaction that you wish you weren't witnessing. It's somewhere on the West African coast, sometime in the era of the Atlantic slave trade, and glass beads are being exchanged for human beings. The exchange rates are documented in historical records, so many strings of beads for a person, with variations based on age, gender, perceived health. The documentation is clinical, precise, horrifying. These beads facilitated one of history's greatest atrocities, and there's no way to discuss them as currency without acknowledging that some currencies are tools of oppression, that money is never neutral, that what facilitates trade also facilitates evil when the trade itself is evil. The value of beads varied wildly depending on context, which is where economic history intersects with power dynamics. In Venice, these beads were cheap, mass-produced trade goods, worth very little. In regions of Africa where glass production didn't exist, where the colors and uniformity were novel, they held more value, though exactly how much is debated. European traders leveraged this value differential, buying low and selling high, except the selling high involved trading beads for enslaved people, for ivory, for gold, in exchanges where the power imbalance was so extreme that calling them trades feels inadequate. There's intense scholarly debate about how to discuss trade beads. Some historians focus on the craftsmanship, the trade networks, the economic mechanisms. Others argue this approach sanitizes atrocity, makes academic what was traumatic, treats as interesting economic history what was actually violence and exploitation. Both perspectives have validity. The beads were currency. They functioned economically, facilitated exchanges, had recognized value. They were also tools of colonization and slavery. These facts coexist uncomfortably, and there's no clean way to separate them. You're holding different types of beads now, and each type has names, classifications, specific manufacturing techniques. Chevron beads with their layered, star-like cross-sections. Millefiori beads with complex internal patterns. Padre beads used by Spanish missions. Collectors and researchers have created detailed typologies, dating methods, provenance studies. There's genuine scholarship here, careful work documenting manufacturing techniques and trade patterns. And there's also the question of whether such scholarship can exist without confronting what these beautiful objects facilitated. In some indigenous American contexts, beads took on meanings and values separate from their trade origins. They were incorporated into artistic traditions, woven into clothing and ceremonial objects, given significance within existing cultural frameworks. The economic value Europeans assigned them wasn't necessarily the value indigenous peoples assigned them. This creates complex questions about valuation, about who determines worth, about how objects move between cultural contexts and acquire different meanings. You're examining a wampum belt now. Not European trade beads, but indigenous currency. Beads made from shells by Northeastern American indigenous peoples, predating European contact. Wampum served as currency, as diplomatic tool, as record-keeping device, in sophisticated economic systems that Europeans often failed to understand or deliberately undermined. When European trade beads entered these economies, they disrupted existing systems, flooded markets with cheap alternatives to laboriously produced shell beads, destabilized currencies that had functioned for generations. The glass-making techniques that produced trade beads were closely guarded secrets. Venetian glassworkers who knew the techniques were forbidden from leaving Venice, on pain of death in some cases, because the bead trade was valuable and Venice wanted to maintain monopoly. The beads required specific glass formulas, particular color compounds, cobalt for blue, copper for green, gold for red. The technology was sophisticated, the manufacturing controlled, the distribution strategic. These weren't random trinkets, they were industrial products created for specific market purposes. There's documentation of resistance to bead currency, indigenous peoples recognizing and rejecting the manipulation. Some communities refused beads, demanded other goods. Others accepted them, but at rates that Europeans found unfavorable. The economic history isn't simple exploitation in every case. There was negotiation, resistance, agency, though always within contexts of massive power imbalance. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't minimize the exploitation. It recognizes that people facing oppression still made choices, still exercised what agency they could. You're in a museum storage room now, looking at collections of trade beads. Thousands of them, sorted by type and origin, each with documentation about where it was found, when, in what context. Some were excavated from archaeological sites. Some were purchased from collectors. Some have provenance that traces back to specific trades, specific contexts. The curator handling them talks about manufacturing techniques, about dating methods, about the scholarship. The conversation is academic, careful, detailed. And underneath, it is the knowledge that many of these beads were currency in transactions that involved human suffering on massive scales. The question of how to remember and discuss trade beads remains unresolved. Do we focus on the artistry and economics, risking sanitization? Do we focus solely on their role in exploitation, risking erasure of indigenous agency and complexity? Do we try to hold both truths simultaneously, acknowledging beauty and horror, craftsmanship and atrocity? There's no comfortable answer, which might be appropriate. Discomfort seems like the right response to currency that facilitated slavery. As you set down the beads, they catch the light, refracting colors that are still brilliant centuries later. The glass hasn't aged, hasn't faded. These objects are nearly indestructible, which means physical evidence of these trades persists, is excavated, is studied, is displayed. The currency outlasts the economic systems it served, outlasts the people who made it and the people who were traded for it, outlasts the empires that used it as tool of expansion. What remains are these small, colorful spheres, beautiful and terrible, objects that force confrontation with the reality that money is never just economic, never neutral, always embedded in power structures that can be exploitative, oppressive, violent. The beads sit in their collections, in their museums, bearing witness. They're historical artifacts now, no longer currency, their economic function obsolete. But they're also evidence, proof of what happened, physical remnants of economic systems built on profound inequality. Looking at them requires holding multiple truths at once, acknowledging craftsmanship and exploitation, recognizing indigenous agency and colonial violence, understanding economic mechanisms and their human costs. It's uncomfortable, complicated, necessary. Some currencies are beautiful. Some facilitate evil. Sometimes both are true simultaneously, and learning to hold that contradiction is part of understanding what money actually is, not neutral tool, but human creation that embodies all of human capacity, for innovation and for harm. The beads scatter and fade, and you're standing nowhere specific now, or maybe everywhere at once. You're in that liminal space between past and present, between memory and understanding, where all these strange currencies exist simultaneously in your mind. Cowrie shells clicking together, salt crystals catching sunlight, chocolate beans counted in market squares, cheese wheels aging in cool cellars, red feathers so light they barely exist, tea bricks compressed to wood-like hardness, stone discs too large to steel, whale teeth polished smooth, iron nails salvaged from ashes, squirrel pelts soft in your hands, peppercorns tiny as seeds, cowbells ringing across mountains, copper crosses perfectly standardized, tobacco leaves slowly molding, glass beads refracting colors. All of it was money. All of it was wealth. All of it worked until it didn't, until circumstances changed and something else took its place. You're holding nothing now, but feeling the weight of everything you've handled. There's a pattern emerging, something that connects these disparate currencies across continents and centuries. They all started as things, actual objects with actual uses or actual beauty, and became money because communities agreed they were money. The agreement came first. The value followed from collective belief, shared understanding, cultural consensus, that yes, this matters, this counts, this can be exchanged for other things of value. Think about the cowries, about those shells from tropical waters that became currency across 3 continents. They worked not because some authority declared them valuable, but because they had the right characteristics: portable, durable, distinctive, difficult to counterfeit. They worked because people decided they worked, and that decision was based on practical considerations that made sense in context. The same logic applies to everything else. Salt was valuable because preservation mattered. Cacao beans because chocolate was desired. Cheese wheels because they literally improved with age. Feathers because they were rare and beautiful. But value was never just about practical utility. The rye stones prove that. 4-ton limestone discs that never move, whose ownership transfers conceptually rather than physically, whose value includes their history and the danger of the voyage that brought them to Yap. That's not practical currency in any conventional sense. That's pure social agreement, collective fiction maintained through community knowledge and shared belief. The stone has value because everyone agrees it has value, and the agreement persists across generations, becoming tradition, becoming truth in the only sense that matters economically. You're thinking about the currencies that were also food, also tools, also decoration. Tobacco you could smoke. Tea you could drink. Nails you could build with. Peppercorns you could cook with. These dual-purpose currencies had intrinsic value beyond their monetary function, which made them more stable in some ways. They'd never be completely worthless as long as their practical use remained, but also more vulnerable, because using them for their intended purpose destroyed their monetary value. Every time someone smoked tobacco currency or drank tea brick money, they were consuming wealth, reducing the money supply through literal consumption. There's something about currencies that age, that deteriorate, that require maintenance. The cheese wheels that could mold, the tobacco that could rot, the squirrel pelts that moths could eat, even the cowrie shells that could crack or break. These currencies couldn't be hoarded indefinitely. They demanded circulation, demanded use, created economies where money had to keep moving or risk becoming worthless. It's the opposite of precious metals sitting unchanged in vaults. These currencies were alive, in a sense, or at least subject to biological processes, organic and temporary and demanding constant attention. And then there are the currencies that involved death, that required killing. Feathers pulled from birds driven toward extinction. Whale teeth taken from massive ocean predators. Squirrel pelts requiring endless small deaths in cold forests. Ivory and fur and leather, money that was once alive, that required taking life to create wealth. There's no judgment here exactly, just observation. Much of pre-industrial currency involved transforming life into economic value, converting living creatures into portable wealth. It's more obvious with fur and feathers than with paper money, but the distance is conceptual rather than absolute. You're thinking about standardization, about the human drive to make things uniform. The Katanga crosses, precisely sized and weighted, mass-produced to exacting standards centuries before Europeans assumed Africans had sophisticated manufacturing. The tea bricks, compressed to specific dimensions, stamped with official seals. The cowbells, each unique, but within understood parameters. Even the organic currencies developed grading systems, quality standards, inspection processes. Humans encountering the problem of currency inevitably develop standardization, because exchange requires mutually understood value, and understood value requires consistency. The authentication problem appears everywhere. How do you know the cacao bean isn't filled with mud? How do you verify the whale tooth is genuine? How do you ensure the tea brick isn't cut with sawdust? Every currency develops verification methods, biting coins, weighing carefully, checking color and texture, relying on expert appraisers whose entire skill is distinguishing real from fake. Security evolves alongside currency, counterfeiters and authenticators in perpetual competition, each innovation by one side prompting counter-innovation by the other. There's geography in all of this, the way location transforms value. Cowrie shells abundant in the Maldives become precious in Uganda. Peppercorns cheap in India are worth fortunes in medieval Europe. Salt common on coasts is valuable inland. The value differential creates trade, creates incentive to move goods across distances, creates the whole structure of commerce. Currency made from naturally scarce materials in specific locations becomes the engine of globalization, centuries before the word existed, as people figured out that buying low in one place and selling high in another could generate wealth. You're considering power now, the way currency embodies and enforces power structures, the glass beads that facilitated colonization and slavery, the tobacco that funded colonial expansion and displaced indigenous peoples. Even seemingly neutral currencies like cowries or salt or cheese were embedded in hierarchies, in social structures where some people controlled production or trade or authentication, where currency access itself became form of power. Money is never neutral. It exists within political and social contexts that shape who benefits and who suffers from its use. And there's memory, the way currencies persist as cultural artifacts even after their monetary function ends. The Chinese character for money still based on cowrie shells. The word salary still carrying salt. Peppercorn rent remaining in legal terminology. Cowbells still ringing in alpine valleys, no longer wealth but still significant. The physical currencies, rye stones, Katanga crosses, trade beads, sitting in museums, bearing witness to economic systems that no longer exist. The past is preserved in objects and language, reminding us that current currency systems are just as contingent, just as historically specific, just as temporary as cowrie shells or tobacco leaves. You're standing at the threshold now, between all those strange historical currencies and whatever money is in your pocket or bank account today. The distance seems vast. Who would use cheese wheels or squirrel pelts as money now? But the principles remain identical. Modern currency works because we agree it works. Its value is collective fiction maintained by shared belief. The paper or metal or digital code has no intrinsic value. We assign value through consensus. We've just abstracted the process, removed it from physical objects with practical uses, created pure representation. But the foundation is unchanged. Money is what we decide it is. Wealth is what we agree matters. Value is always and only collective belief. The strange currencies fade further now, becoming memory, becoming history, becoming these stories you've carried through the night. But they leave understanding behind. That money is human invention, that it takes whatever form serves human needs in specific contexts, that what seems strange from outside makes perfect sense from within. Cowrie shells, salt blocks, chocolate beans, cheese wheels, feather coils, tea bricks, stone discs, whale teeth, iron nails, squirrel pelts, peppercorns, cowbells, copper crosses, tobacco leaves, glass beads. All of it was logical. All of it worked. All of it was money, until it wasn't, until circumstances changed, and humans invented something new, as they always do, as they always will, adapting currency to need to currency, in the endless improvisation that is economic history. The journey is complete now, all 17 sections told, and it's time to let the night fully settle around you. The strange currencies have faded into historical memory, their stories told, their lessons absorbed into the quiet space of your mind. What remains is the gentle understanding that money, in all its forms, was always just agreement, shared belief made tangible, whether in shells or stones or leaves or bronze. Let yourself sink deeper into comfort now. Feel the weight of your body against whatever surface supports you. Notice how heavy your limbs have become, how your breathing has slowed without you deciding to slow it. Each breath arrives softer than the last, each exhale releasing a little more of the day's tension, a little more of the need to stay alert and analytical. The currencies you've encountered tonight, those cowries and crosses and cheese wheels, are settling into memory like sediment drifting to the ocean floor, slowly, inevitably, finding their places in the vast repository of things you know. The night around you is patient. It doesn't require anything from you. No decisions to make, no problems to solve, no currencies to authenticate or transactions to verify. The marketplace is closed. The caravans have stopped for the night. The salt roads are empty under starlight. Even the cowbells have gone quiet as cattle settle into sleep. There's a deep stillness spreading across all those historical landscapes you've visited, and that stillness is here with you now, in this room, in this moment. Your eyes may already be closed, or perhaps they're growing heavier, the lids weighted with the pleasant fatigue that comes from traveling so far through time and space. Either way is fine. There's no effort required now, no need to focus or concentrate. The stories have been told. The journey has been taken. What's left is simply rest, simply allowing the night to hold you the way darkness holds those limestone discs on Yap, the way ocean holds cowrie shells between tides, the way cool cellars hold aging cheese wheels. Think about those rye stones one more time, if you can still think at all. Those massive discs that never move, whose value is entirely in shared memory and collective agreement. Your mind is becoming like that, still, unmovable, held in place by the gentle consensus of sleep. Thoughts may drift by like ownership of those stones, changing hands conceptually while nothing physical shifts. Let them drift. Let them transfer. Let consciousness settle into the deep, unchanging foundation of rest. The currencies all had their time, their moment of being important, being valued, being the thing that mattered. And then time moved on, and they became history, became stories, became these gentle images accompanying you into sleep. Everything has its season. Right now, the season is night, is rest, is the soft darkness that asks nothing of you except that you surrender to it. Your breath is a rhythm now, steady as waves against the beaches where cowries gathered. In and out, soft and slower, each cycle carrying you deeper into the quiet place where sleep lives. There's no counting needed, no attention required. The rhythm maintains itself, ancient and automatic, the way tides move and seasons turn and night follows day without anyone deciding it should be so. The weight of all those strange objects, salt blocks, tea bricks, copper crosses, iron nails, has left your hands. You're holding nothing now. You don't need to hold anything. The currencies have returned to their historical moments. The stories have been told, and you're here in the present, in the dark, in the soft approach of sleep that comes like morning fog rolling in from the ocean, inevitable and gentle and complete. Let the last images fade now. The marketplace sounds, the caravans, the workshops, the ceremonies, all of it settling into the quiet archive of memory where dreams are stored. Your body knows what to do. It's been moving towards sleep this entire journey, and now the destination is here, just beyond the last conscious thought, just past the final breath you notice before consciousness releases its gentle hold. The night is deep and safe. The stories are over. The strange currencies rest in their historical moments, and you rest in this moment here now, where there's nothing left to do but sleep. Sweet dreams, traveler. The journey has ended. The rest has begun. Sweet dreams.